Today we have some more actual history about the life of the Indian slayer Tom Quick. This is episode 3 in our series on Tom Quick's life, and today we will hear about the vengeance he took upon the Indians who had killed his father in 1756. The events we will hear about today likely occurred after the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, when peace was declared, and some Indians began interacting with the whites in eastern Pennsylvania once again. But men like Tom Quick were not looking to bury the hatchet. It was hard for him and many of the settlers to forget how their family members had been brutally killed or captured during the war. We will be reading from this book, Tom Quick, the Indian Slayer, by James E. Quinlan. This book was published all the way back in 1851. So here are the first stories of Tom Quick's vengeance upon the Indians. These events and others are what gave him the name Indian Slayer. Little or nothing can be learned of Tom's conduct during the French War. He did not enlist in the army, as has already been intimated, for the tradition of his relatives clearly indicates that he never could be persuaded to place himself in a situation in which he would be obliged to submit to military discipline. He chose rather, when he felt a disposition to engage in the shedding of blood, to do so in the language of the present day, on his own hook. It is said, however, that he rendered important services to the English in their excursions against the Indians by acting as a guide, whenever his services were required. Even though tradition does not say he signalized himself by any extraordinary deed, it is probable that he was not idle from the period of his father's death, until the event occurred which we shall soon describe. After the war, such of the former inhabitants of the Delaware, Musquink, etc., as were living, returned and reoccupied their farms and clearings, and a broken band they were, but few families had not lost by disease or the tomahawk some of its members. The Indians too began to revisit their old haunts, probably supposing that, as the hatchet was now buried, they would be as well received by the whites as they had been before the war, but their former friends no longer regarded them with favor or affection. The fire and the scalping knife yet retained a vivid place in the recollection of the settlers, who had become merely nominal friends of the Indians. In the hearts of many of the whites ranked a deep and undying hatred, which needed but a safe and favorable opportunity to slake itself in blood. They had suffered so much during the war, and the Indians were so barbarous and cruel, so unlike soldiers of the old world in waging hostilities, that the whites could not readily forget the past, and treat their late enemies as friends. On coming in contact with the red men again, they felt very much as a person who has submitted to a painful surgical operation does when he sees the instruments that had tortured him. They knew that there was no immediate prospect of suffering again, yet they experienced an unconquerable aversion and disgust at seeing the dread objects again. It is said that some of the wives and daughters of those who had lost relatives by the hands of the Indians would faint if they encountered the Indians after the war. Notwithstanding this hatred and aversion, nearly all of the settlers were careful to avoid all cause of offense. They dreaded a renewal of the bloody strife which had just closed, and if they consented to live as friends with their old neighbors, it was because their own safety and interest prompted them to do so. Among the Indians who came back was a drunken vagabond named Musquink or Modelin, who had assisted in murdering Tom's father. The fact, however, that he had engaged in this sanguinary transaction was not known at first. If it had been, probably he would have disappeared without anyone being the wiser except Tom. About 2 years after the war, Tom had occasion to go to the house of a man named Decker, who kept a tavern on the Neversink. Decker was one of the early settlers on that river, and had thus far escaped the tomahawk and scalping knife. When Tom reached the tavern, he found Musquink there, somewhat intoxicated and very bold and talkative. He at once claimed Tom as an acquaintance, and wished to drink with him, but Tom refused to do so, and bestowed a contemptuous epithet upon the Indian, which caused the snake-like eyes of the latter to glitter with rage. A conversation of an irritating character passed between them, during which the Indian, for no apparent purpose except to exasperate Tom, boasted of his exploits in the warpath, and among other things gave a detailed account of the killing of Thomas Quick Sr., and the part he himself had taken in the affair. He asserted that he had scalped the old man with his own hand, mimicked the grimaces of the dying man, showed how he appeared while in the agony of death, and to corroborate his assertions, exhibited the silver sleeve buttons worn by the victim at the time. This brutality had a greater effect than the drunken Indian had anticipated. It most effectually aroused the devil in Tom's heart. He at once determined to kill the Indian. He was unarmed, but there was a French musket in the barroom, in the place where the early settlers kept such implements. That is to say, on spikes or pegs driven into a beam, directly over the hearthstone, where they were not apt to rust, and could be got at handily in any such emergency which might arise. Almost with the quickness of thought, Tom took down the musket, ascertained that it was loaded and primed, and cocked it. The Indian saw this movement of Tom, and a vague notion of what was impending seemed to force itself upon his stupefied senses, but before he could make an attempt to resist or escape, the muzzle of the musket was within a few feet of his breast, and Tom ordered him to leave the house. The Indian at once resigned himself to his fate, or at least to the guidance of Tom. He arose slowly and sullenly from his seat, and proceeded to the door, Tom following after him. No one who was present seemed to think that murder would grow out of the affair, for no one appeared to have curiosity sufficient to make him attempt to witness its termination, which would not have been the case if it had been supposed that Tom intended to do more than compel the Indian to leave the neighborhood. Tom drove the Indian into the main road leading from Wurtsboro to Carpenter's Point. After proceeding about a mile toward the latter place, he exclaimed, "Indian dog! You'll kill no more white men!" And, aiming the musket, which was loaded with a heavy charge of slugs, shot the Indian in the back between the shoulders. Musquink jumped 2 or 3 feet from the ground, and fell upon his face dead. Tom took from him the buttons which had belonged to his father, drew the dead body to a tree that the wind had torn up by the roots, and, kicking some leaves and dirt over it, left it there. Some say that he cut the head from the body, and hoisted it on a pole at the corner of the road leading to Decker's, and that it remained there several days. After killing the Indian, Tom returned to Decker's, put his musket in its proper place, drank a glass of rum, and left the neighborhood. Several years subsequent, the land upon which Musquink was killed was cleared and plowed by a man named Philip Decker, when the bones of the Indian were turned up. The murder of Musquink created considerable excitement in the exposed neighborhoods. Some thought that such transactions should be properly investigated, and that Tom should be arrested and sent to prison, while others contended that he had performed a very meritorious act. It does not appear that an attempt was made to punish him for what he had done, for he continued to fish and hunt unmolested, although he was in danger from the Indians. That Tom was permitted to kill the Indian with impunity is extraordinary, because the authorities were not always careless as to what was done by the frontiersmen in their intercourse with the natives, as will appear by what follows. On the 25th of December, 1771, Daniel Skinner, Jr., with his brother Haga, some other white men, and several Indians, were at the house of Nicholas Conklin in Coshecton. According to an old document, the red men were something in liquor, and one of them asked Daniel to give him some rum. Daniel refused to do so, whereupon the Indian got angry, and struck Daniel, and Daniel struck him back. In the scuffle which ensued, one man was stabbed, and the Indian seemed to have been handled roughly. When the Indian who was at fault became sober, he acknowledged that he had done wrong, and promised to make satisfaction for the damage he had done. Notwithstanding this, Daniel and Haga were put to considerable trouble in consequence of the emuette. They were complained of by one Nathaniel Evans, who had the peace and welfare of the community so much at heart that on another occasion he was hired to carry a message to the Indians, which was intended to produce a collision between the two races. The governor and council of New Jersey, who at that time claimed jurisdiction over Coshecton, and we do not know how much more, ordered the Skinners to be arrested for the offense they had committed, which it was feared would involve the province in a bloody war, unless the offenders were brought to condign punishment according to law. The Skinners ransacked Coshecton and Musquink for testimonials in their favor, and the matter became a serious one for them, although it does not appear that the charge against them was sustained. The complaint was probably made more for the purpose of getting the accused into trouble than to promote peace and welfare of the province. Why a matter so trifling should have been considered of so grave a nature, while Tom was enabled to escape without being questioned, is something which cannot be explained at this late day. We have elsewhere remarked that Tom, from associating with the Indians a greater part of the time when he was young, had become an Indian in thought and sentiment. Yet when he considered red men so barbarous that a white man was justified in making their destruction his whole business, and although he denounced their cruelty, he could be equally savage himself. Not only this, but he would use the Indian argument in favor of destroying the helpless and defenseless. We do not know that he was ever guilty of killing on more than one occasion the children of his enemies, and his excuse for doing that was that they would, if their lives were spared, become as bad as their parents. He then thought it good policy to destroy the serpent while it was in embryo. Not long after Tom shot Musquink, he was hunting in the vicinity of Butler's Rifts. He was yet wild with the excitement growing out of that transaction, and boiling with the desire to imbrue his hands again in Indian blood. His success in hunting had not been very great, but he was probably troubled very little on account of his ill luck, for he had a greater desire to meet with Indians and slay them, than to encounter what he considered less brutal beings. He was not many days in waiting for an opportunity to gratify his revenge, if revenge like his could be gratified. One day he stationed himself at the foot of the rift, but whether to watch for Indians or wild beasts is not known. However this may be, he found the former. He watched several hours without seeing anything of importance, but finally was rewarded with the sight of 5 Indians coming up the river in a canoe. The party consisted of a man, a squaw, and 3 children. The Indians seemed to be unarmed, and he and the others were evidently not apprehensive of danger. They were on the same side of the river as Tom, and were proceeding leisurely along, the children enjoying the journey and seeming very happy. As soon as Tom saw them, he concealed himself in the long reed grass which grew on the shore, and awaited their approach, with the determination to destroy them. As they came near, he recognized the Indian as one of those who had visited his father's house before the war, and who had been engaged in several outrages on the frontier. When the Indian family, for the squaw was evidently the wife of the man, and the children his own, had got near enough to be within gunshot, Tom raised up from his recumbent posture, and ordered them in the Indian tongue to come ashore, and threatened to fire if they did not. As soon as the man saw Tom, he turned very pale. He had heard while below of the murder of Musquink, and that Tom had threatened to kill others of his race. He dared not disobey, however, and reluctantly came to the shore. Tom then inquired where they had been and where they were going, to which answers were given. He then told them that they had got to their journey's end, that the tribe to which they belonged had murdered his father and several of his relatives during the war, and that he had lifted up his hand in vengeance against their whole race. The Indian answered that it was peacetime, that the hatchet was buried, etc., but Tom replied that there could be no peace between the Indians and him, and that he would wage eternal war with them. He then shot the man, who jumped out of the canoe into the river, where after a few convulsive throes he died. Tom, after killing the Indian, tomahawked the squaw and her children. As the hatchet sunk into the brain of the squaw, she sprang instinctively towards her youngest child, and fell on the bottom of the canoe, and was soon beyond the pale of mortal life. The 2 oldest children, as Tom afterwards declared, squawked like young crows as he killed them. He had proceeded thus far without any compunctions of conscience, or feeling that he was committing a most horrible massacre, which ranked him with incarnate demons. But when he came to the youngest, his murderous propensities were for a moment checked. As he raised the tomahawk to give the fatal blow, the babe, for it was nothing more, looked up wonderingly into his face and smiled. The innocence and unconsciousness of danger beaming from its sunny, childish eyes caused him to relent. His arm fell to his side. He could not strike it. At the moment, the idea of taking the life of such an innocent, harmless being seemed horrible to him. It held out its tiny hands to him, and in childish glee seemed as if it would spring to his arms. Tom's heart was completely softened. He thought that he would convey it to some white family, and have it taken care of properly, and fancied that it would be very pleasant to have such a pretty, innocent creature to fondle after he had been hunting, and when he returned to the settlements. but the fact suddenly thrust itself into his mind that the child would in a few years become an Indian, and this so enraged him that he instantly dashed out its brains. In consequence of the excitement which grew out of the murder of Musquink, Tom thought it prudent to conceal the bodies of his victims. Besides this, he was probably conscious that his white friends would not think very favorably of him if they knew he had murdered helpless women and children. Having procured some strips of basswood bark from a neighboring tree, he fastened heavy stones to the bodies, and one after the other conveyed them to the deep water of the rifts, where he sank them to the bottom. After all the bodies had been disposed of, he destroyed the canoe, and nothing remained but his own conscience to tell of the horrible deed. Tom did not relate the foregoing facts until it was safe for him to do so. Previous to his death, he repeatedly told them to Jacob Quick, Esquire, of Callicoon. When asked why he killed the children, his invariable reply was, "Nits make lice." On another occasion, Tom was at Pond Eddy on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, in company with a relative named Peter Quick. While there, an Indian known as William George was discovered in a canoe on the river, and coming directly towards them. Tom made Peter squat in the reed grass, and told him that they would have some sport with the Indian. They remained concealed until the Indian came close to them, when Tom rushed from the grass, aimed his rifle at the Indian, and ordered him to come ashore. William George appeared to be much frightened when he saw Tom, and did not dare to do otherwise than as he was directed. Tom asked his business, etc., and then told him that he should die. And he would have killed him at once if Peter had not interfered, and with much difficulty prevailed upon him not to kill the Indian. Tom then ordered William George to go about his business, and the latter seemed very willing to get beyond the reach of Tom's rifle, for he paddled off in fine style. As the canoe was shooting through the water, and while it was still within reach of Tom's lead, he drew up his rifle, aimed at the fast-retreating Indian, and exclaimed, "Thunder, how I could tumble him out of the canoe!" The Indian was soon out of sight. Tom, during the remainder of the day, was very morose, and seemed to be angry at himself because he had permitted the Indian to escape. It is probable that he killed many of the Indians in this way. For some time, Tom was very careful to commit no more murders openly. A favorite mode with him was to go to the Indian hunting grounds, and remain concealed as much as possible from the Indians. Whenever he heard the report of a gun, he would creep cautiously towards the place where it was fired, and if he succeeded in finding it, he would generally discover an Indian skinning a deer or a bear, and once when discovered, it was an easy matter to send a bullet through his head or heart. Tom would then conceal the body of his victim, finish skinning the game, take the skin of the animal, as much of the flesh as he desired, and the rifle of the dead Indian, and depart in search of new adventures. Generally he deposited the rifle in a cleft of rocks or hollow tree, but if he took it to the settlements and was asked how and where he got it, he would say that he had found it beside a dead Indian, and when he brought an unusual number of skins, he would quietly tell them he had shot one buck on top of another, meaning that he had killed an Indian in the way we have just indicated. This enigmatic manner of describing what he had done was the only kind of witticism that Tom was ever known to utter. When in the settlements and an Indian came there, he would pretend to be friendly toward him, and do everything in his power to allay suspicion. If he could gain the Indian's confidence, he would, in the end, invite him to join in a hunting excursion, and the Indian would generally be among the missing forever thereafter. Among the rest, 2 Indians came to Musquink to sell their skins and procure ammunition, and a few other articles which they needed. They lingered about the settlement several days, and became acquainted with Tom, who finally induced them to join him in a hunt at Hagen Pond, in what is now known as the town of Lumberland. Tom was thinking of various places to kill his companions, when one of them proposed to remain at the pond and fish, while Tom and the other agreed to spend the day in hunting. The arrangement was that they should take separate routes, and meet during the day at Rock Cabin. This afforded too good an opportunity to be lost by Tom, who was afraid to attack both at once, as they were equal to him in skill and agility. According to arrangements, he took the direction he had agreed to go, and after hunting a short time, he proceeded to the cabin, where he selected a good place to watch for the coming of the Indian he had agreed to meet there. At the time appointed for meeting, the stealthy tread of the Indian was heard in the thickets. In a few moments he emerged to sight, and with a shriek fell upon the earth a corpse. Tom's sure rifle had found another victim. Some leaves and mold were soon thrown over the body, and Tom was on his way back to the pond. Here he waylaid the other Indian and killed him. At another time, Tom encountered an Indian at Hagen Pond, but did not succeed in killing him. Tom went to the pond to hunt with a man named Cornelius DeWitt, who, during the Revolutionary War, was captured by the Indians and taken to Canada. Almost as soon as they reached the pond, Tom saw signs of Indians being there and exclaimed, "There are Indians about! You get some wood for a fire and I'll look them up." DeWitt was of a more humane or timorous disposition than Tom, and objected to his getting into trouble with the Indians, but nothing he could say had any effect of the Indian killer. Tom seemed more like a wild beast raging for blood than a human being. He instantly prepared for an encounter. He examined the flint of his rifle, and the powder in the pan, threw aside every cumbersome and useless article, and took to the thick underbrush which lined the shore of the pond, accompanied by his dog. He crept through the bushes as noiselessly as a snake would have done, and yet seemed to get over the ground quite fast. He continued to go on in this manner, until he got near the outlets, where he had to leave the bushes and cross an open space. While he was doing this, he discovered an Indian a considerable distance off, on the Big Marsh as it was called. The Indian had a gun and was probably hunting for ducks or wild geese. He saw Tom about as soon as the latter discovered him, and with the instincts of his race, at once suspected that the white man was bound on no friendly errand. He instantly fled into the adjoining woods and disappeared, going apparently toward the Delaware. This occurred just before sunset, and when Tom saw the Indian run away, he returned to the place where he and DeWitt intended to stay during the night. DeWitt had gathered but little wood, and it was needless to do so, for prudence taught them that they should dispense with a fire that night, as a light would serve as a beacon to the Indian, and enable him to turn the tables against them, if he was disposed to harm them. The next morning Tom told DeWitt that he intended to look the Indian up. DeWitt objected, but found it was useless to oppose Tom. Search for the Indian he would, whether it was agreeable to the other or not. He soon found the Indian's trail, and followed it in company with DeWitt. The most sagacious of the red men could not pursue an enemy through the woods more unerringly than Tom. Through a forest which would be as trackless as the ocean to any of the present inhabitants of Sullivan, if anything short of an ox or horse should walk in it, Tom continued in pursuit, discovering at every step undoubted indications of the passage of the hated Indian. Here a wood plant or weed was crushed. There dead leaves upon the ground showed that a moccasined foot had pressed them. Here green mold on some fallen tree had been disturbed. There on the rivulet's margin the footprint was plain. On went Tom through the solitary forest, bent upon his bloody mission of expiation and revenge. Every effort of the wily Indian to baffle Tom was of no avail. The Indian slayer followed him to the Delaware, and thence to the Brink Pond in Pennsylvania, where he again came in sight of his intended victim, a feat probably which none but an Indian had ever before accomplished. At the Brink Pond, Tom and the Indian saw each other again, but the latter was beyond the reach of the other's rifle, and Tom had not the satisfaction of bringing him down. The Indian, finding that his life depended upon his speed, fled like a frightened stag, and Tom, knowing that his pace would not soon be slackened, and that he would have to follow him too far into the Indian country for his own safety, gave up the chase. From the Brink Pond the two men went home, without killing a deer. So that's it for this episode. This is episode 3 in our series on the life of the Indian slayer Tom Quick. In this episode we found out why they called him the Indian Slayer, including the only story where Tom was known to have killed women and children. He was said to have some remorse at killing the youngest Indian child, and perhaps this at least caused him to spare women and children in his lifelong war against the Indians. Let us know in the comments what you think of Tom's actions. This story also mentioned that along with Tom's father, who was killed in 1756, several of Tom's other family members were killed during the French and Indian War. Tom seems to have had family connections with many of the people mentioned in this video. A man named Decker owned the tavern where Tom met Musquink, and learned that he had been in the party which killed Tom Quick Sr. in 1756. Decker was the maiden name of Tom's mother, so it is likely that this man named Decker had some relation to Tom. This book also mentioned a man named Peter Quick, who joined Tom on one of his trips. This was probably the nephew of Tom, Petrus Quick, born in 1745, the son of Tom's older brother, Jacobus Quick, who was born in 1716. Peter Quick was married to Hannah DeWitt, who was the niece of Cornelius DeWitt, the man who accompanied Tom on another of his hunting trips. The Jacob Quick Esquire mentioned in this story was possibly the son of Peter Quick and Hannah DeWitt, born in 1775. This story also mentioned William Franklin, who was Benjamin Franklin's illegitimate son, and the last colonial governor of New Jersey before the Revolution in 1776. Unlike his father, William Franklin joined the Loyalist side during the Revolution, and was part of the Loyalist occupation of New York throughout the war. In 1782 he fled to England, and he never returned to America again. He died in London in 1813. Let us know in the comments below if you'd like to hear more stories about the Indian slayer Tom Quick. And stay tuned to this channel for more actual history about people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, we keep this worthy history of our ancestors alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support the mission of our channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.